They crossed the wire, expecting screams, bullets, fists, and revenge. Because for 12 years, they had been warned that surrender meant annihilation. German soldiers stripped of rifles, medals, certainty marched into Allied captivity, convinced they were walking into hell. Some had cyanide sewn into collars, others whispered last prayers, because propaganda had promised humiliation, torture, and death. But the shock began immediately, not with violence, but with silence. The sound of boots. Stop in orders spoken calmly, hands raised not in threat but instruction, and in that moment fear did not vanish, it sharpened, because nothing is more frightening than an enemy who does not behave as expected. They waited for the first beating. It never came. They waited for insults. They did not hear them. Instead there were lists, numbers, procedures, water poured into cups, medical gloves snapping onto hands, and a strange, unbearable normality that felt wrong, dangerous, like the calm before execution. And many believed it was only a delay, that punishment would arrive. Once the gates closed, but hours turned into nights and nights into mornings, and still no retribution came, and the realization slowly crept in that captivity was not temporary chaos, but structured, controlled, deliberate, and this confused men trained to respect only force. Barbed wire enclosed them, not like a cage, but like a boundary between worlds. Inside were thousands of Germans, officers, mechanics, farm boys, professors, teenagers, men who had burned cities, and men who had never fired a weapon, all reduced to the same uniformless identity, prisoners waiting for something to happen, and what happened instead was routine. Roll calls at dawn, meals at fixed hours, medical inspections, guards who followed rules, guards who did not scream, guards who sometimes smiled, and this unsettled the prisoners more deeply than cruelty ever could, because cruelty fits expectations, kindness fractures belief. Food became the first crack in indoctrination. Thin soup, bread, unfamiliar, canned meat, but regular, consistent enough to keep bodies alive. Guards ate the same rations, sometimes worse than starving German soldiers who had scavenged frozen fields. During the retreat from the east, could not reconcile this generosity with everything they had been taught. Cigarettes appeared, coffee, sometimes chocolate, and the rumor spread quickly that surrender had saved their lives. Nuts ended them, and yet guilt accompanied every bite, because survival felt undeserved. Women appeared next, nurses, Red Cross workers, clerks, translators, moving through the camps with authority, calm, and distance. Not the caricatures of enemy women painted by propaganda, but professionals who treated wounds, changed men, spoke gently but firmly, and 4 men raised in a rigid, militarized masculinity. This presence cut deep because it forced them to see themselves, not as warriors but as patients, dependents, human beings, and some could not meet their eyes, because shame rose faster than hunger. Interrogations arrived quietly, no fists, no darkness, no screams, just questions delivered. Patiently, chairs, tables, cigarettes, pauses designed to let silence do the work. And many Germans spoke, not because they were threatened, but because they wanted to be heard. Because after years of shouting orders, the calm invited confession, and afterward men returned to barracks shaken by how his ally words had left them and how little resistance had remained. Once, fear was removed. Time slowed, days blurred together, marked only by weather roll calls and memory without combat, without orders, without ideology reinforced. Daily thoughts surfaced that had been buried for years. Questions about cities destroyed, families lost orders, obeyed neighbors, disappeared. And this was perhaps the greatest shock captivity gave them time to think, and thinking was dangerous because it led to doubt, and doubt eroded certainty faster than bombs. Guards varied. Some were distant, some friendly, some carried their own scars from battle. But what united them was restraint, and that restraint became unbearable to prisoners, who had prepared for hatred because hatred would have confirmed everything they believed instead. They were faced with men who enforced rules without cruelty, who punished without humiliation, and who did not seek revenge. And this created a psychological vacuum where ideology could not survive. Rumors traveled through the wired, whispers of camps, films, photographs, evidence of atrocities. Many refused to believe it. Others feared it. When re-education screenings began, some turned away. Some vomited, some stared in silence, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they thought they were fighting for. And no one forced applause, no one demanded repentance. The Allies understood that truth presented without violence carries more weight than confession beaten from the body. Illness spread, but treatment followed. Wounds were cleaned. Amputations performed. Lives, save men who expected to be discarded instead, received care, and the shame of being healed by former enemies lingered long after scars closed. Because gratitude conflicted with indoctrination, and gratitude is dangerous to hatred. As months passed, seasons changed, guards rotated, prisoners aged quickly, conversations deepened, ideology hardened, and some collapsed in others. Friendships formed across former ranks, aristocrats shared bunks with factory workers, and the rigid hierarchy of the Reich dissolved into shared vulnerability, and this frightened many more than defeat because it proved the world could function without the structure they had believed eternal. Letters arrived slowly, news of destroyed homes, dead relatives. Missing children in captivity began to feel less like imprisonment and more like insulation from a broken homeland, and this reversal shocked him deeply because the camp had become safer than freedom and no one wanted to admit it. Release came without ceremony, names called, papers stamped, hands shaken, and suddenly the wire opened, not as punishment, but as exit. Guards wished him luck, some even offered advice, and former enemies walked away carrying memories heavier than chains, returning to a Germany in ruins, haunted by questions that had begun behind wire and would never end. What shocked German POWs most in Allied camps was not mercy alone, but what mercy forced them to confront: the collapse of lies, the weight of responsibility, the terrifying realization that humanity survives even after everything else has failed. And decades later, when survivors spoke of captivity, they did not describe beatings or hunger. First, they described the moment they realized the enemy was human, because that was the moment the war truly ended. And something far harder began: remembering.